Don't. Don't do this. But the rancher slept with her anyway, and the whole town turned on him. Bare feet never belong in burnt grass. Not out here where the sun strips mercy from the land and a man can live 30 years without once needing to explain himself. But that afternoon, Carl Casper saw them, pale, torn, streaked with blood, and it stopped him cold in the middle of his Tuesday fence check. He reined in his mare and stared. The world around him was still. Nothing but the hiss of dry wine through scorched earth and the creak of worn saddle leather. Carl was 58, weathered by decades of discipline and distance. 3 decades on this ranch had turned him into a man who preferred his days predictable and his neighbors polite but far away. Yet here he was, looking at a woman who had no business being there. He swung down from the saddle, boots landing with a soft thud on the hardpan. The woman lay sprawled in the open field, half hidden by brittle grass. Her dress, once white, maybe cream, was torn at the shoulder and streaked with dust and sweat. Her dark hair clung to her face in matted strands. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps, like she'd been running far longer than her body could sustain. One hand clutched weakly at the dry earth. The other lay limp at her side, fingers curled as if she'd been reaching for something she'd never quite caught. Carl approached slowly. Carefully. The way a man approaches something fragile that might shatter if he moves too fast or comes too close. Her eyelids fluttered. When they opened, he saw brown eyes, dark and clouded with exhaustion and something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or resignation. Eyes that had stopped expecting kindness. He knelt beside her, and his shadow fell across her face. She flinched, just slightly, as though even shadows carried weight now. When she tried to speak, her first breath cracked. The second carried a whisper he barely heard. Please. Don't. Carl felt the words hit him somewhere he'd thought had long since calcified. He'd heard desperation before. He'd heard lies, manipulation, and every excuse people conjured when they were cornered. But this voice wasn't lying. It wasn't even pleading. It was breaking. He glanced across the open land, scanning the distant ridgeline where heat shimmered and bent the horizon. This kind of fear didn't arrive alone. It had wheels behind it. Engines. Men who would follow a trail until it ended, one way or another. Carl looked down at her again. At the trembling in her fingers. The bruises blooming purple along her forearms. The sheer, stubborn will it must have taken to drag herself this far into nowhere. He knew nothing about her. And God help him, he didn't need to. Some trouble you see coming. Some trouble you hear. And some trouble arrives barefoot and broken, collapsing on land that hadn't seen a stranger in years. The question now was simple. What kind of man leaves a woman to die in his field because it's easier than getting involved? Carl Casper had spent 30 years becoming the kind of man who didn't ask that question. But the answer, the one he'd been avoiding his whole careful, controlled life, was staring up at him with hollow eyes and bloodied hands. Don't, he muttered to himself, even as he slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. Don't do this. But he lifted her anyway. Carl carried the woman across the field toward the ranch house that had been his fortress and his prison for 3 decades. She was lighter than he expected, the kind of light that came from too many missed meals and too many nights spent running. Her breath was warm and uneven against his chest, and he could feel the flutter of her heartbeat through the torn fabric of her dress. Inside, he laid her carefully on the guest bed, a narrow mattress in the back room that hadn't been used since his sister visited 5 years ago. The house smelled of leather, old coffee, and the faint tang of wood smoke. It was the smell of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. Carl fetched a basin of water, tore strips from a clean towel, and uncorked a bottle of whiskey that had been sitting unopened on the shelf since last winter. He cleaned the dirt and blood from her arms and face, working in silence. She didn't cry out, though her jaw tightened with pain. That alone told him plenty. When she finally opened her eyes again, clearer now, though still shadowed by exhaustion, she simply watched him. Trying to decide, he figured, if he was another threat or the first safe place she'd found in a long time. Carl kept working. Talking too soon never helped anyone. After a while, she whispered, her voice thin and hoarse. "Thank you." Her fingers clutched the blanket as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Something real. Carl nodded once, rinsing the cloth in the basin. "You ran a long way." It wasn't a question. But the silence that followed was. She hesitated, then swallowed hard. "Yes." Carl leaned back in the chair beside the bed, folding his hands. He'd lived long enough to recognize the difference between someone who was lying and someone who was terrified to tell the truth. "Someone coming after you?" Her eyes flicked toward the window, as if expecting to see headlights cutting through the dusk. "Yes. And they won't stop. Not until they find me." Carl felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard stories like this before, back when he was younger, back when the world still felt like something he had a stake in. Men with money. Men with power. Men who took what they wanted and buried anyone who got in the way. What do they want? Lena, no, Kathy, he'd learn later, closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering what little strength she had left. They want me back. Or they want me dead. I'm not sure it matters to them which. Her voice was flat. Factual. Like she'd already accepted both possibilities. Carl sat there without moving, letting her words settle into the stillness of the house. He didn't know her name yet. Didn't know where she'd come from or what she'd done to end up here. But something in the way she spoke, quiet, certain, resigned, cut through every wall he'd built. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere beyond the fence line. The land was still. But the stillness felt like the pause before lightning strikes. One truth was becoming clearer with every passing second. If this woman was telling the truth, then trouble was already closer than either of them wanted to believe. And Carl Casper, man of routine, man of silence, man who had spent 30 years keeping the world at arm's length, had just invited it into his home. Thanking you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin. Carl Casper woke at 5:30 every morning, not because an alarm told him to, but because his body had learned the rhythm 30 years ago and never forgot. He rose in the dark, pulled on the same worn jeans and flannel shirt he'd laid out the night before, and walked to the kitchen where the coffee pot waited, already prepped from the evening prior. By 6, he was outside. The land stretched gray and endless under the pre-dawn light, and Carl moved through it like a man who'd memorized every rock and post. He fed the horses first, 3 of them, all past their prime but steady, then checked the water troughs, oiled the gate hinges that had started to squeak, and walked the perimeter of the barn looking for anything out of place. He didn't find much. He rarely did. That was the point. The people of Dust Creek knew Carl Casper the way you know a landmark, reliable, unchanging, unremarkable. He paid his bills on time. He nodded to folks at the feed store but didn't linger for conversation. He attended the occasional town meeting, sat in the back, and left before anyone could corner him with small talk or favors. He didn't gossip. Didn't gamble. Didn't drink more than a single whiskey on a Saturday night, alone on his porch, watching the sun drop behind the hills. He didn't get involved. That had been his rule for as long as anyone could remember, and it had served him well. No debts. No drama. No one asking him to pick sides or fix problems that weren't his to fix. Some folks thought he was cold. Others thought he was smart. Carl didn't much care which. By mid-morning, he'd finished the barn work and saddled his mare for the weekly fence check. It was Tuesday, which meant riding the southern property line, 2 miles of barbed wire and wooden posts that separated his land from open range. He did it the same way every week, slow, methodical, eyes scanning for breaks or sag in the wire. The sun climbed higher, turning the air dry and heavy. The land stretched flat and quiet in every direction, nothing but burnt grass and the occasional stubborn yucca. Carl liked it that way. Liked the silence. Liked knowing exactly what his day would hold. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a scrap of cloth caught on the fence, fluttering in the wind. But as he rode closer, the shape clarified. Something pale against the scorched earth. Something that didn't belong. Carl reined in his mare and stared. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his saddle. The land around him was still. Too still. And in the distance, half hidden by the tall grass near the fence line, something, or someone, lay motionless under the unforgiving sun. Carl's jaw tightened. He'd built his whole life on knowing what not to do. But sometimes, trouble doesn't wait for permission. Carl dismounted slowly, boots hitting the hard ground with a dull thud. He left the mare ground-tied and approached on foot, rifle loose in his right hand. The woman lay crumpled near the fence line, her body twisted at an angle that spoke of collapse rather than rest. No shoes. That's what he noticed first. Her feet were torn and blistered, caked with dried blood and dust. Her dress, what was left of it, hung in tatters around her legs. Dark hair spread across the grass like spilled ink, and her face, turned toward the sky, was streaked with dirt and something darker. Carl knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, faint, rapid, but present. She was alive. For now. He scanned the horizon, looking for vehicles, dust trails, anything that might explain how she'd ended up here. Nothing. Just empty land stretching in every direction, baking under the midday sun. He should call the sheriff. That was the smart move. The safe move. Let Tom Briggs handle it, let the county take responsibility, let someone else ask the hard questions. But the nearest phone was back at the house, 2 miles away. And by the time he rode back and made the call, she'd be dead. Carl looked down at her again. At the bruises mottling her arms. At the way her fingers were still curled, as if she'd been clutching something, or clawing her way forward, right up until her body gave out. He cursed under his breath. Then he slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees and lifted her as gently as he could. She didn't weigh much. Too light, really, for a grown woman. The kind of light that came from running on fear and nothing else. He carried her back to the mare, who shifted nervously at the smell of blood. It took some doing to get the woman draped across the saddle while he walked alongside, one hand steadying her, the other leading the reins. By the time he reached the house, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. Inside, Carl laid her on the guest bed and set to work. He fetched water, clean cloths, and the half-empty bottle of whiskey from the cabinet. He cleaned the cuts on her feet first, then the scrapes along her arms and shoulders. She didn't stir. Didn't make a sound. It wasn't until he was wrapping a bandage around her left foot that her eyes snapped open. She gasped, sharp, panicked, and tried to sit up. Carl stepped back, hands raised. Easy. You're safe. Her eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused, searching for exits. When they landed on him, they narrowed. Who are you? Carl Casper. This is my ranch. I found you collapsed near my fence line. She pulled the blanket up to her chest, breathing hard. Where's my... She stopped herself. Swallowed. How long was I out? Couple hours, maybe. You need a doctor. No, the word came fast and sharp. No doctors. No police. Carl studied her. The fear in her voice wasn't the kind you faked. You in trouble? She didn't answer. Just stared at him, jaw tight, weighing whether he was a threat or the only chance she had. Finally, she whispered, "You wouldn't understand." Carl pulled the chair over and sat down, keeping his distance. Try me. But she turned her face toward the wall and said nothing. Carl sighed and stood. He'd get answers in the morning. Right now, she needed rest more than interrogation. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back. Locks on the inside, he said quietly. Use it if it makes you feel safer. Then he stepped out and closed the door behind him. 3 days passed in careful silence. Kathy, she'd given him her first name on the second morning, nothing more, stayed mostly in the guest room. Carl heard her moving around in there, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of water running in the small bathroom. She emerged only for meals, always hesitant, always watching the windows. Carl cooked simple food. Scrambled eggs and toast in the morning. Sandwiches at noon. Stew or beans in the evening. He set her plate on the table without ceremony, and she ate without speaking, her eyes fixed on the food or the grain of the wood or anywhere but him. But slowly, something shifted. On the 4th day, she helped clear the dishes. Carl didn't ask her to. She just stood, gathered the plates, and carried them to the sink. Her movements were careful, deliberate, the kind of precision that came from habit, not necessity. Carl noticed her hands. They were slender, soft in places that should have been calloused if she'd worked outdoors. The nails were short but clean, and though her fingers trembled slightly when she gripped the plates, there was a grace to the way she moved. Educated, he thought. Or at least raised with expectations. That night, when they sat across from each other at the small table, she finally spoke. "Thank you. For not asking questions." Carl shrugged. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She almost smiled. Almost. Over the following days, the silences between them grew less rigid. She started lingering at the table after meals, sipping the weak coffee Carl made in the old percolator. Sometimes she'd glance at the books on the shelf near the window, dusty westerns and a few worn volumes on animal husbandry, and he caught her once running her fingers along the spines like she missed the feel of pages. "You read much?" he asked one evening. "I used to." Her voice was quiet. Distant. "Feels like a long time ago." Carl didn't press. But he noticed other things too. The way she startled at sudden sounds, the crack of settling wood, the distant bark of a coyote. The way she stood at the window sometimes, staring out at the empty land like she was expecting something to appear on the horizon. And he noticed the pale band of skin on her left ring finger where a wedding ring used to sit. She caught him looking once. Her hand moved instinctively to cover it, and her expression hardened. "Don't," she said softly. Wasn't going to ask. But the tension hung between them anyway. On the 7th night, after they'd finished a quiet meal of roasted chicken and potatoes, Kathy leaned back in her chair and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "Why are you helping me?" Carl set his fork down and considered the question. He could have said it was the right thing to do. Could have said he didn't know. Could have deflected entirely. Instead, he told the truth. "Because I know what it's like to want to disappear." Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or relief. She nodded slowly, and for a moment, the walls between them didn't feel quite so high. That night, Carl lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't remember the last time someone else's presence in his house had felt like anything other than an intrusion. But this, whatever this was, felt different. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. It happened on the 10th night. Carl woke to the sound of muffled sobbing coming from the guest room. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, telling himself it wasn't his business. That she'd come to him if she needed something. But the sound didn't stop. He pulled on his jeans and walked barefoot down the hall. The door was cracked open, pale moonlight spilling through the window inside. Kathy sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking, one hand pressed against her mouth as if she could force the grief back down. "Kathy." She looked up, eyes red and swollen. For a moment, she seemed embarrassed. Then something broke, and the words came tumbling out. "He'll find me. He always does. You don't understand, Garrett owns half this county. Shell companies. Real estate. He has judges, sheriffs, people who owe him favors." Her voice cracked. "He'll make it look like I'm crazy. Like I ran away because I'm unstable. And no one will believe me because no one ever does." Carl stepped into the room slowly. "What did he do to you?" She laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes. "What didn't he do? He controlled everything. Where I went. Who I spoke to. What I wore. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing faint scars along her forearm. When I tried to leave the first time, he locked me in the house for 3 days. Told everyone I was sick. Carl felt his jaw tighten, a slow anger building in his chest. The second time, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, he broke my wrist. Told the doctor I fell down the stairs. She looked up at him, and the rawness in her eyes cut straight through every wall he'd built. I can't go back. I can't. Carl didn't think. He just moved. He sat beside her on the bed and pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. He held her, one hand smoothing her hair, the other wrapped around her shoulders. "You're not going back," he said quietly. "I won't let that happen." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her face inches from his. Her breath was warm and uneven, and something passed between them, something unspoken, something dangerous. "Carl." "Don't," he muttered, even as his hand moved to her cheek. "Don't do this." But she leaned into his touch, and when her lips found his, he didn't pull away. They shouldn't have. He knew that. Knew it was reckless, knew it was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But in that moment, with her hands clutching his shirt and her breath mingling with his, none of it mattered. They moved together in the dim light, slow and desperate, two people reaching for something they'd both forgotten how to want. Afterward, she fell asleep with her head on his chest, and Carl lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The tenderness was there. Undeniable. The way her fingers curled against his ribs. The soft sound of her breathing. The warmth of her body pressed against his. But so was the dread. Because he knew what this would look like. Knew what people would say. A 58-year-old man and a young woman with no past, no explanation, no one to vouch for her. He'd told himself not to get involved. He'd told himself to keep his distance. "Don't," he whispered into the darkness. But he'd done it anyway. Carl drove into Dust Creek on a Thursday morning, the same as he always did. He needed feed, fencing wire, and a few groceries, nothing unusual. But the moment he stepped into Harwell's Feed and Supply, he felt the shift. Conversations paused. Eyes flicked toward him, then away. May Harwell, who'd run the register for 20 years and always greeted him with a nod, barely looked up. Carl loaded his cart in silence and brought it to the counter. May rang up the items without a word, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Finally, as she bagged the last of it, she spoke. "Heard you got company out at your place." Carl kept his expression neutral. "That so?" "Mm-hmm." Betty Cranston's nephew was driving past Tuesday evening. Said he saw a woman on your porch. May's eyes met his, sharp and probing. "Young woman." Carl handed her cash. "Didn't know I needed permission for house guests." May's jaw tightened. "Just saying, Carl. People talk. And when a man lives alone as long as you have, and then suddenly there's a strange woman no one's ever seen before," she trailed off, letting the implication hang. Carl took his change and his bags without another word and walked out. At the diner, it was worse. He stopped for coffee, and the usual faces at the counter, men he'd known for decades, went quiet when he sat down. No one greeted him. No one asked how the ranch was doing. Just silence and sidelong glances. By the time Carl loaded the truck and headed home, his hands were tight on the wheel. He'd known this would happen. Known the moment he brought Kathy inside that it would only be a matter of time before the town started whispering. But knowing didn't make it easier. When he pulled up to the house, Sheriff Tom Briggs was waiting, leaning against his cruiser with his arms crossed. Carl cut the engine and climbed out. "Tom." "Carl." Tom's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "Got a minute? Seems like you're already taking it." Tom didn't smile. "Folks are saying you've got a woman staying with you. That true?" Carl met his gaze evenly. "What if it is? Then I'd say you're playing with fire." Tom pushed off the cruiser and took a step closer. "No one knows who she is. No one's seen her before. And now there's talk she might be running from something, or someone. She needed help. That's real noble, Carl. But if she's in trouble, that trouble's gonna land on you. And if you're not careful, it's gonna land on this whole town." Tom's expression hardened. "Whoever she is, you need to be smart about this." Carl said nothing. Tom waited, then sighed and shook his head. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." He climbed into his cruiser and drove off, leaving Carl standing alone in the driveway. That night, after the sun had set and the house was quiet, Kathy sat across from Carl at the kitchen table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her face was pale. "I need to tell you something," she said. Carl waited. She took a breath. "My husband's name is Garrett Scott. He owns Scott Development, half the commercial property in 3 counties. He has connections. Judges. Politicians. People who owe him." Carl's stomach tightened. "And he'll kill anyone who helps me," she continued, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Not himself. He's too smart for that. But he'll send people. And they won't stop until I'm back under his control. Or dead." Carl sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him like lead. "You should have told me that from the start. Would you have helped me if I had?" He didn't answer. Because he didn't know. The town hall meeting was called for Saturday evening. Carl didn't plan on going, but Tom Briggs showed up at his door that afternoon and told him he didn't have a choice. "They're talking about you, Carl. About her. You need to be there." So Carl went. Alone. He'd told Kathy to stay at the ranch, and for once, she didn't argue. The meeting room at the community center was packed. Carl walked in and felt every pair of eyes turn toward him. He found a seat near the back, but the isolation was immediate. The chairs on either side of him stayed empty even as people filed in and the room filled to capacity. Mayor Ed Polk called the meeting to order, his voice tight and formal. "We've got some concerns that need addressing. I'm sure most of you have heard by now that we've had some visitors in town this week." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ed continued. "2 men came by my office Thursday. Said they were looking for a woman, a Mrs. Kathy Scott. They had documentation. Marriage license. Medical records." He paused, letting that sink in. "They say she's mentally unstable. That she stopped taking her medication and ran off. And they say Karl Kasper is harboring her. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, some angry, some fearful. Karl sat stone still, his jaw clenched. One of the men stood, Dale Hutchins, who owned the hardware store. "Is it true, Karl? You got this woman at your place?" Karl met his eyes. "I do. And you know she's married?" "I know what she told me." "Which is what?" Dale pressed. "That she's some victim. That her husband's the bad guy." He shook his head. "Her husband's Garrett Scott. The man owns half this county. He's got lawyers, Karl. And those men who came through, they had papers. Legal papers. They also had a story," Karl said evenly. "Doesn't make it true." Betty Cranston stood up, her face pinched with concern. "Karl, we've known you a long time. But this woman, no one knows her. And now you're telling us we should just take your word that she's telling the truth. I'm saying she deserves a chance to tell her side." "Her side?" Dale scoffed. "She's not even here." Pastor David Greer rose from his seat near the front, his voice measured and calm. "Karl, I understand you want to help. That's admirable. But sometimes the right thing, the godly thing, is to step back and let the proper authorities handle it." He looked around the room. "This woman has a husband. A legal husband. And if she's unwell, she needs professional care. Not, whatever this is." Karl's hands tightened on the armrests. May Harwell spoke up next. "What if something happens, Karl? What if those men come back and there's trouble? You're putting this whole town at risk." "I'm not putting anyone at risk." "You already have," May shot back. "Just by keeping her." Tom Briggs stood and held up a hand. "All right, let's keep this civil." He turned to Karl. "Karl, I'm gonna ask you straight. Are you willing to cooperate if Mr. Scott's legal team requests a welfare check?" Karl stared at him. "You asking me to hand her over?" "I'm asking you to think about what's best for everyone involved." The room went quiet. Karl looked around. At faces he'd known for 30 years. Neighbors. People he'd helped, who'd helped him. And not one of them met his eyes now. He stood slowly. "I came here because Tom said I should. But I can see how this is gonna go." He walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one spoke. And as he stepped out into the cooling evening air, Karl realized the truth. He'd lost everything he'd spent 3 decades building. And it had taken less than 2 weeks. They arrived Sunday morning, just after dawn. Karl was feeding the horses when he heard the engine, a low, steady rumble that didn't belong to any truck he recognized. He set down the bucket and walked to the front of the barn, one hand resting on the rifle he'd started carrying everywhere. A black SUV rolled up the gravel drive and stopped 30 feet from the house. 2 men climbed out. The first was tall and lean, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket despite the heat. His face was all sharp angles, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. He moved like a man who'd spent time in the military, or worse. The second was broader, thick through the shoulders, with a shaved head and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He stayed near the vehicle, hands loose at his sides. The tall one walked forward, stopping at the edge of the porch. He smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Carl Casper. Carl didn't move. That's right. Name's Vance. I work for Garrett Scott. He gestured casually toward the house. We're here for Mrs. Scott. We'd appreciate it if you'd bring her out. She's not going anywhere. Vance's smile didn't falter. See, that's where you're confused. Mrs. Scott is Mr. Scott's wife. Legal wife. Which makes this a domestic matter. And you? You're just a guy who got himself tangled up in something that's none of his business. Carl's grip tightened on the rifle. She stays. Vance sighed, like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Mr. Scott's been very patient. He understands his wife's been under a lot of stress. Hasn't been taking her medication. Sometimes people do irrational things when they're not well. He took a step closer. But this has gone on long enough. Now, you can make this easy, or you can make it hard. Either way, she's coming with us. No, she's not. The big man by the SUV shifted his weight, and Carl caught the glint of metal under his jacket. Vance tilted his head, studying Carl like he was something mildly interesting. You really want to do this? You're what, 50-something? Living out here alone, no family, no backup. We could make you disappear, and no one would even notice for a week. Then why haven't you? Vance's smile widened. Because Mr. Scott's a reasonable man. He doesn't want trouble. He just wants his wife back. He pulled a card from his pocket and set it on the porch railing. You've got 24 hours to think it over. After that, we stop being polite. He turned and walked back to the SUV. The big man climbed in, and they rolled back down the drive, gravel crunching under the tires. Carl stood there long after they'd disappeared, his heart pounding. Inside, Kathy was waiting by the window, her face pale. They're not going to stop, she whispered. I know. Carl, you should let me go. Before this gets worse. He looked at her, and for a moment, he considered it. Considered the easy way out. The safe way. Then he shook his head. We've got 24 hours. Let's use them. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Carl boarded up the windows facing the drive, reinforced the door locks, and dragged his gun safe into the living room. He had 3 rifles, a shotgun, and his father's old revolver. He loaded them all. Kathy helped without being asked, moving furniture to create cover, filling containers with water, gathering supplies. Carl showed her the root cellar, a narrow space beneath the kitchen with a hidden entrance. If things go bad, you get down there. Understand? She nodded. That night, they sat in the dark living room, rifles across their laps, watching the road. Neither of them slept. They came back at dawn, just as Carl knew they would. 3 vehicles this time. The black SUV and 2 pickups. 6 men total, spreading out as they rolled up the drive. Carl watched from the window, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Stay low, he said to Kathy. Don't fire unless you have to. She nodded, crouched behind the overturned couch with the shotgun braced against her shoulder. Her hands were steady. Too steady for someone who'd never done this before. Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, megaphone in hand. "Carl. Last chance. Send her out and we leave clean." Carl didn't respond. Vance lowered the megaphone. Then he nodded to his men. The first shot shattered the front window. Carl returned fire, the crack of the rifle splitting the morning air. One of the men dove behind the SUV. Another scrambled toward the barn. Then all hell broke loose. Bullets ripped through the boarded windows. Wood splintered. Glass exploded inward. Carl moved from window to window, firing controlled shots, forcing them to stay behind cover. Kathy fired the shotgun once, twice, through the side window. One of the men screamed and went down clutching his leg. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" Carl shouted over the chaos. "My father," she yelled back, pumping another round. "Before Garrett made me forget everything I used to be." Two men broke for the barn. Carl tracked them through the scope and dropped one with a shot to the shoulder. The other made it inside. Smoke began to curl from the barn's side door. "They're torching it," Carl muttered. He grabbed the old canvas pack from the corner, the one he'd packed the night before, and slung it over his shoulder. Inside were 3 sticks of blasting dynamite he'd kept from his younger days working demo on a mining crew. Old, unstable, dangerous as hell. "Cover me." Kathy fired steadily as Carl kicked open the back door and sprinted toward the barn. Bullets chewed up the ground at his heels. He dove through the side entrance, rolled, and came up firing. The man inside spun, clutching a jerry can. Carl's shot took him in the chest. Flames licked up the far wall where gasoline had been splashed. Carl grabbed the dynamite, lit the fuse with shaking hands, and hurled it toward the center of the barn where he knew the old fuel tank sat buried under years of hay and debris. Then he ran. He hit the ground 20 feet from the barn just as the explosion tore through the structure. The blast wave lifted him, slammed him down hard. His ears rang. Fire and debris rained from the sky. When he looked up, the barn was gone, just a crater and burning wreckage. The remaining enforcers were retreating, dragging their wounded toward the vehicles. Vance stood by the SUV, staring at the destruction, his face twisted with rage. He pointed at Carl. "This isn't over." Then they were gone, engines roaring as they fled down the drive. Carl pushed himself to his feet, coughing, his shirt scorched. Kathy ran to him, grabbed his arm. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." He looked at the burning remains of his barn, then at the house. Smoke poured from the shattered windows. The ranch, his sanctuary for 30 years, was burning. And he knew Vance was right. This wasn't over. The law arrived 2 hours later. Tom Briggs, 3 state troopers, and a federal agent named Cortez who'd been building a case against Garrett Scott for 18 months. Carl and Kathy sat on the porch steps, covered in soot and ash, as emergency crews worked to contain what was left of the fire. The barn was gone. Half the house was gutted. The land Carl had maintained for 30 years looked like a war zone. Cortez crouched in front of them, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Scott, we're going to need your full statement. Everything you know about your husband's operations." Kathy nodded, her voice hoarse. "Shell companies. Bribery. Intimidation. He had a man killed 2 years ago, a county inspector who wouldn't sign off on one of his developments. Made it look like an accident. Cortez's eyes sharpened. Can you prove it? I kept records. Documents. I hid them before I ran. Kathy looked at Carl. They're in a storage unit in Ridgefield. Unit 217. Cortez stood and made a call. By evening, the news was spreading. Garrett Scott had been arrested. Federal agents had seized his properties, his files, his accounts. The evidence Kathy provided, combined with witness testimony and forensic analysis, was damning. His empire was collapsing. But for Carl, the damage was already done. Over the following days, people came by. Some to gawk at the wreckage. Some to offer hollow condolences. A few, very few, to say they'd been wrong. But most stayed away. At the next town meeting, opinions were split. Some called Carl a hero for standing up to a criminal. Others called him a reckless fool who'd endangered the community and destroyed his own life for a woman he barely knew. May Harwell wouldn't look at him. Dale Hutchins shook his hand but said nothing. Pastor Greer offered prayers but no apology. The respect Carl had spent 30 years earning was gone. And everyone knew it. 3 weeks later, Carl stood in the ashes of his barn, staring at the blackened foundation. The insurance would cover some of it. Maybe he could rebuild. Start over. But the thought felt empty. Kathy walked up beside him, arms crossed against the evening chill. I should go, she said quietly. Let you rebuild. Let you have your life back. Carl was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. This life. He gestured at the ruins around them. I spent 30 years building walls. Keeping people out. Keeping myself in. He turned to face her. I broke my own rules. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding behind them. Kathy's eyes searched his face. Carl, you don't owe me. This isn't about owing. He reached for her hand. It's about choosing. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him, something fragile and hopeful breaking through her exhaustion. Where would we even go? Carl glanced at the empty road stretching west. Somewhere no one knows us. Somewhere we can start over. You'd really leave all this? He looked at the ruins of his ranch. At the land that had been his prison as much as his sanctuary. There's nothing left here worth staying for. 2 days later, they packed what little remained into Carl's truck. No fanfare. No goodbyes. As they drove past the Dust Creek town sign, Kathy reached over and took his hand. Carl didn't look back. For the first time in 30 years, he was choosing to be seen. Choosing connection over safety. Choosing a future he couldn't control. And somehow, that felt like freedom.